Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
So welcome to Sense and Sustainability. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. It's my pleasure today to introduce a colleague, Mel D'Silva, who heads up the Sustainable Procurement Practice within Action Sustainability. Mel, welcome.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm the lead consultant for sustainable procurement, worked at Action Sustainability for 4 years, and of course we run the training for the Supply Chain Sustainability School as well. Thank you for having me, Sean.
Thanks, Mel. So that's what you do now. Let's take you back to your early career. Tell us, because obviously we've worked together for some time now, and I know that you have a very varied and interesting background that I think our audience would love to hear about. So yeah, tell us what you've done and how you got to where you are today.
All right, so I've got roughly around little over 2 decades experience in procurement, supply chain management and social value. So collectively 21 years. I worked for a decade in the Middle East, so that is Dubai. That was typically construction procurement as well, dealing with mixed use towers, universities, a lot of airport projects as well across the Middle East. Before that, I was working in India, a little bit of procurement, different industries, so aviation, travel and tourism, hotel management as well. So very, very different experience. I came to UK roughly around 11 years ago and went straight into Crossrail. It's a very steep learning curve for me there. Rail sector, a very high value project. I worked on Thames Tideway East and High Speed 2. My career goes way back to when procurement was responsible not just for sourcing, purchasing, and the actual procurement, but to the point when goods and services arrived on site, making sure it was right time, place, quantity, quality, price, but also receiving materials from airports and seaports and, all of that, Incoterms as well. Very, very interesting experiences. I've even ran to airports to help make sure 24-inch butterfly valves fitted into an aircraft and got delivered on time. So different stories, different experiences in different geographies.
That's interesting because that's very similar to my early experience in procurement in the oil and gas sector, where the procurement function was responsible for the entire value chain, including inspection, quality assurance, expediting delivery on time, inventory control, and all of those things. And we kind of seem to have lost that as a profession a little bit, haven't we? It's a little bit more focused now on the transaction.
Correct. Yes, back in the day, it was proper plan, source, and manage. I think we are privileged, in some ways pampered. Now we can plan, source, and go to the pub because you now have a separate commercial team who manages the contracts. You do a smooth or a very quick handover of contract, fully executed insurances, maybe your balance scorecard and whatever, and then you're on to procure the next biggest, shiniest thing ever. So then it's over to them to manage the contract, yes.
How does that work for you? Because in the construction industry, certainly in the UK and in other parts of the world, there is that split between what we would call procurement and what we would call commercial. And personally, I kind of don't see the difference. Does it work having that handover, or is it more effective, in your opinion, to have the more seamless approach where you pick up a requirement for the business and the job's not done until that requirement is completely satisfied?
I've seen both aspects of it. Now, it depends on the amount of resource each company has. I've seen the function where procurement does everything from the sourcing, so early contractor engagement, involvement, meet the buyer events. Then you go through your pre-qualification, tender, you award the contract. And those procurement managers have the skills to do supply chain management as well, but also the resource. So they get involved in the quarterly reviews or your half-yearly relationship management as well. Departments or organizations that don't have that resource, they use a buying team, a procurement team to procure, but then they use QSs, quantity surveyors, to manage the contract. That's not a bad thing, but oftentimes your commercial function is not upskilled in what to look out for, what data needs to be gathered. And if they do get that data, whether it's sustainability related or the 5 rights of procurement, what do we do with that? Who do we feed it back to? Then it becomes that part also can become a bit of a transactional exercise. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution. I have seen QSs step in to do the procurement angle as well, where you see a lack of staff or resources. I think the entire function, procurement tends to sit under the financial commercial directorate anyway. Upskilling the entire function on sustainability as well will ensure you get buy-in from all teams, especially the budget holders, and they come along with you on the journey. We're not here to convert a commercial manager into an environmental manager, but just make them part of the bigger picture.
We touched on a dozen different things there.
Yeah.
Let's come to sustainability. You mentioned early contractor involvement and also supplier relationship management, because obviously these are two kind of quite critical things that don't always get done.
Correct.
There is sometimes a let and forget culture within procurement teams. Would you like to talk a little bit more about your experience, well, with those two things, with early contractor involvement and also supplier relationship management?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes if you're a project-based procurement team, you don't always have the luxury of time to do early contractor involvement for all of your tenders. And also all of your tenders won't need that kind of strategic involvement. Most of it's transactional where possible. And some of the examples from my own career is we would sit down with the procurement schedule, look at what we're going out to tender for, look at the value, the duration in the next 6 months or the next financial year. Pre-COVID, this would take the sort of makeup of face-to-face events with the supply chain, meeting up with them, talking about any sort of technical requirements that were specific and even sustainability requirements. Now, the benefits of that early supplier or contractor involvement is that you're giving them a feel of what's to come in the PQQ, in the tender, what will be bound into the contract, so that you're not shocking them at the end and then it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg at the end if your requirements are niche or brand new to the market. It works well. We tended to do these events in the rail sector when I was involved, especially for SMEs. SMEs tend to feel quite overwhelmed with large tender packs, documents. They feel like, I'm never going to be able to work with this organization. I'm an SME, I don't have the skills. So breaking it down for them, breaking down the tender responses. We've done events where we've done mock tender exercises, especially for SMEs, helping them to answer those questions so that they don't feel like they've been cut out of the tender process. So it works well. This can also take the shape of online events these days. We don't tend to do a lot of face-to-face, but I think the supply chain really appreciate that kind of early involvement. Another example is with a train operating company. So we've developed tender questions for them for the procurement process, but they wanted to ensure they socialize it with the SMEs and the large suppliers. So their kind of early engagement involves some webinars around procurement, carbon, modern slavery, and talking about the types of questions to come. So it does work well. Again, time, resource permitting. Supplier relationship management, again, I think it tends to fall off the radar. We do supplier performance management really well. Those are tied to actual orders or contracts that you might have within an organization, a project, or a joint venture. Relationship management is different. Relationship management is with your key strategic partners. You may or may not have a current live order or a contract with them. This is mostly at director to director level. You're talking about the future. What can you do about things like diversity, STEM activities, reducing carbon, modern slavery audits, due diligence? You're thinking long term, you're thinking strategic, but those are supply chain you deal with on and off, but you've been dealing with them for years or decades. So it is an important part, because when you do get into contract with them, those sort of key messages and your shared values then get flowed down into the process.
So we've touched on weaving in sustainability objectives, because that's, one other thing, one other business outcome that we're trying to achieve through procurement. But of course, it's still relatively new. It doesn't seem all that new to me, but it is in the world of things. So when you start to bring sustainability into the equation, you've already mentioned that procurement people are not sustainability experts, but obviously need to have some knowledge. How's that working for you? We've talked about the procurement piece needs to be right. We talked about the early contractor involvement. We talked about engaging SMEs and getting them to understand the business in a better way. And we talked about the whole more strategic supply relationship management piece. All of those building blocks really need to be in place in order to do sustainable procurement well, don't they? Do you have examples of how it's done well, or maybe how it's done not so well?
Yeah, I think sometimes organizations come to us as clients to go on a sustainable procurement journey. And sometimes we see that the procurement process itself, that house is not in order. So you're trying to go on a sustainable procurement journey, but you don't have the sort of building blocks and what we refer to as your enabler, so your governance process, any kind of upskilling for your team, etc. I think for organizations, my advice would be is try and start to tidy up your procurement process as well. Now, take this with a sack of salt. It depends on the sector, the industry in which you operate. What's the size of your organization? What's the nature of it? We tend to see with infrastructure construction, for example, you do have time for strategic procurement, but for example, facilities management can be quite reactive, for example. So what's the nature, what's the industry in which I'm operating? Therefore, make sure your procurement process aligns with that. Don't try to put a lot of fancy tools and templates and contract formats in place, but make sure it follows a logical process of early involvement where possible, some sort of an onboarding or a pre-qualification, so you're vetting your suppliers really early on. Whether that's manual, you've got a lot of tools and portals out there, a robust tender process that lays out what you expect from your supply chain, and the most important part is segregate your purchase orders and contracts. The mistake I see is a lot of organizations award a lot of large orders, whether it's services or goods or works, on purchase orders, and your T's and C's do not sort of align with what you're trying to get out of your supply chain. So tidy up your procurement house first and then start to think about your sustainability requirements. Otherwise, it can be quite messy.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that, because like you, I've worked with so many clients that say, we want you to help us to be good at sustainable procurement. And you take a look at their procurement practices and go, well, in the politest possible way, your procurement's rubbish. So how do you expect to be good at sustainable procurement if you're not good at procurement in the first place? So I'm sure our audience would really, really appreciate that. That kind of takes us quite neatly on then. I mean, you started to describe a more strategic approach, I guess, to sustainable procurement, which brings us nicely to the standard, to ISO 2400. Because that's what we hope it does for people, and that's where ISO2400.org. So I guess we need to talk about that, don't we? How do you see the standard? I know you use it a lot. I know you use it a lot with your clients. How's it working for you, and what's the client reaction?
Yeah, now it depends on what the client is looking for. Believe it or not, Sean, till date, I get asked for, can you come in and do an audit? And I think I've had that bit of fatigue of explaining to organizations. ISO 2400 is a guidance standard. So it's all about continuous improvement. It's about implementation rather than a tick box exercise and you're expecting a shiny certificate, put it in a gold frame on the wall. You get a mix of organizations, you get a range of organizations in certain sectors. For example, it's mandated. Organizations need to be evaluated every 24 months. So I see a couple of clients come back. They, based on our evaluations and recommendations, they do some implementation work. And we'll come to that in a while. Then you have the other set of organizations. They may have had an evaluation. They may have used your self-assessment tool on the website and got a score, and they are genuinely going on a long-term journey. So in terms of upskilling themselves, their own supply chain, tidying up their contracts, their tender questions, making it relevant and proportional. So you get two sort of groups of organizations. How is it working? Now it depends for you as a client organization how you want it to work for you. Are you using it as an audit or a tick box exercise and coming back every 2 or 3 years, or do you want to go on that long-term implementation journey? For those who are going on that long-term journey, we can actually see a lot of social value generation from them using the standard, a lot of risks that have been mitigated, now risks that they were not even aware of. But by implementing the outcomes of ISO 2400, like heat mapping, they have had some eureka moments, they have engaged with those risky supply chains, done some audits, introduced some contract KPIs. So it's working well for them. And we can see year-on-year improvement in those organizations, collaboration internally and externally. So it seems to be working well. If I had to think about anything I'd like to add, in the standard, I'd say an increased sort of emphasis on transparency that links in, with the transparency clauses, modern slavery as well. But it is in there to quite a degree.
So do you have examples of value creation? I mean, we hear this sustainable procurement costs more all the time. Do you have examples of clients that you work with? Because ultimately, yes, it's great to eliminate risks. It's great to improve your environmental performance or whatever. But that often doesn't wash with the finance director. It's all about the bottom line. Do you have examples of clients that have applied the standard, worked through their sustainable procurement process and actually deliver greater value?
Yes, so I'm going to mention a couple of clients. Again, these are case studies on the website, so I have permission to sort of talk about them. These are a varied range of clients. The first I'll mention, and this has been a guest on a previous podcast, is Imperial College London. They first engaged with us roughly around a year and a half, 2 years ago. They have their sustainability strategy, that's 2021 to 2026. And they figured out very quickly that that needs to be implemented. It cannot be a dusty document. One of the ambitions they wanted to heavily concentrate on was their laboratories and also decarbonizing a lot of what they buy. There's a lot of embodied carbon in whatever is being procured. So through the various categories of spend, they were looking at where was the highest impact in terms of carbon, whether that's embodied, packaging or transport, end of life, etc. Throughout the sort of life cycle of procurement, we looked at where were the sort of gaps, what were they asking, what were they missing out on engaging with their supply chains with. So we helped them develop a sort of toolkit and a guidance pack for procurement professionals. We have trained their internal faculties and departments. All of their heads of faculties and departments, their laboratories are on board with it. We've prepared some sort of questions that they can use to engage with their supply chain. The reason I know it's been impactful is a couple of the category suppliers reached out to me after this piece of work to say, Mel, Imperial as a client are asking us these questions and we're a supplier to them. Can you tell me how I can be a more sustainable supplier, not just to Imperial but to the higher education sector? And that's when we knew that that's a measure of success, because they are engaging, but now the suppliers also genuinely want to come along on that journey. They are still on the journey. They're doing a lot of work with the different departments. They've got estates, they've got laboratories, etc., getting their internal stakeholders on board. So that's one of the examples. And they're starting to see a lot of benefits coming out of that as well.
So yes, as you say, Imperial College have done a podcast on this series. So those of you that are listening, please do find that because it's fascinating. One thing I really liked about Imperial College is we had the sustainability director and the procurement director on the same call, and it was seamless. That they were absolutely on the same page. They knew exactly what they wanted to achieve. And this whole issue of sustainability people and procurement people not really understanding each other was not an issue for me, was not, certainly at the leadership level, wasn't an issue with Imperial College. It was as if, we were almost talking to one person. So would you like to talk a little bit more about those relationships and how they work or maybe how they don't work so well?
Yes. That's a very important point, because oftentimes I see with organizations is that the sustainability team is leading the whole sustainable supply chain piece. And somewhere along the way, they either do not or they forget to involve the procurement team. You cannot get there from there, because what that happens is you will either have a very over-engaged supply chain or a completely frustrated supply chain. If an organization is claiming that 70 to 90%, somewhere in the middle, that amount of spend is with the supply chain, then guess who's spending the money? It is procurement. So my advice to sustainability, ESG, CSR teams is, after this call, go and find your procurement team, because they are the catalyst that will help embed your sustainability criteria in that top-down golden thread methodology approach and out to the supply chain. And it absolutely, Sean, like you said, it has to be a joined up approach so that you're not confusing the supply chain, over engaging them. And I've seen from my experience, we have supply performance management meetings separately for the 5 rights of procurement. And at another time in the same month, the sustainability team is reaching out to the supply chain. So we're double doing things. In fact, we run workshops through the school called Bridging the Gap. And one of the ideas behind the workshop is to get the procurement and the sustainability teams talking to each other throughout the procurement process, so that both teams know at which touch points in the procurement process they need to liaise with each other really, really early on, so that you are generating social value in a systematic manner. So yeah, do find each other, sustainability and procurement teams, and start talking really, really early on.
It's a very good point, because, as you say, with this issue of kind of over-engaging or different parts of an organisation engaging with the same suppliers, the inevitable consequences of that would be the price would go up.
Correct, yes.
Because the suppliers get confused, they're going to put a lot of risk into the tender then, because they need to allow for issues of working with a bad procurement process. And as you know, I always say sustainability shouldn't cost you more, but bad procurement will definitely cost you more.
That's true. And one of the other things that occurs is, if sustainability went directly to the supply chain, you lack visibility of the commitments around sustainability or any of the technical criteria that the supplier or the subby has promised in that tendering process. So if they've promised you the moon on a stick, you should be getting the sun, moon, stars, and a couple of galaxies as well. So yeah, do liaise via the procurement process. It'll definitely be more efficient.
Thanks very much, Mel, to your insights into your fascinating career and some really practical advice and examples for our listeners around implementing sustainable procurement. So this is part 1 of 2 of our podcast series with Mel. We look forward to part 2, where Mel will be sharing more experience around sustainable procurement around the world. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.